ties in with our theme, which is being invited up into a bigger story. But it also ties into what we talked about last week, which was coming into the dark so that our eyes can adjust and we can see the light in all the places where God is at work. So for me, this video really tied in to what we're going to be talking about this morning, but reached back and touched a little bit on our theme for last week. The passage that was read earlier from Isaiah is both one of my most favorite passages in Scripture and one of my most embarrassing memories. There was a day about 15 years ago when I was a pastor in Saratoga Springs, New York. And I have a brother and sister-in-law who are in ministry in Montana, and they were visiting us in New York. And I actually preached. We were preaching through the gospel, and we got to this passage where Jesus quotes this passage that John read from Isaiah, where the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, right? That very famous passage. And that was our topic for the day, and I preached it, and I was so happy with how it turned out. Preach the paint off the walls, as they say. Afterwards, my brother-in-law comes up to me, and as a family, we've walked a long journey together. They knew me when I was in high school before I even got my calling. And so we walked a long road together. And he came up to me afterwards and he said something pretty simple, but my faith would never recover. It was one of those moments where somebody sort of pops your balloon, and from then on, it's just sort of everything just deflates. This conversation began what would end up deconstructing my faith and for me to become this, whatever this thing is. This is how it began. So I preach this passage, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Preach good news to the poor, right? My brother-in-law comes up to me afterwards and says, it's weird. You make everything spiritual. And I said, well, thank you. He said, no, I don't mean that in a good way. What? And he said, you keep splicing in spiritual, but not saying it. You keep assuming it. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, this passage that Jesus is talking about, he was talking about actual prisoners. But you mean people who are in spiritual bondage. He was talking about people who are actually hungry. You're talking about people who are spiritually hungry. He was talking about people who are actually sick. You mean those who are spiritually suffering. You make everything spiritual. And it's one of those really simple things that, until somebody names it, sometimes you don't recognize you're doing it. And I realized that I had bought into a type of Christianity that was otherworldly. It was like caught up in the heavenlies, right? In the heavenly realms, right? The kingdom of the ages, whatever you want to call it. But that I had spiritualized everything, and not in the good way. I was a very spiritual person, unlike now. Where I'm very religious, but not spiritual. A lot of people are spiritual, but not religious, Dory. That's the joke there. Not me, baby. I'm religious, but not spiritual. So this passage haunts me because I realized I had been invited into an otherworldly story. You ever heard the saying that Christians are so heavenly minded they're no earthly good? I was one of those. Because I didn't visit people in prison. I didn't feed hungry people. We didn't take care of those who were sick. We were concentrating on the bigger things, the kingdom, as it were, the heavens. I was one of those people. And it devastated me to figure out, holy crud, I am putting something in here that's I'm not doing it intentionally, but I'm so inundated with this. It so saturates my mentality that I see it even where it is not. I supplement it. I put it in. I make things spiritual that aren't spiritual. Does anybody else in this camp with me know what I'm talking about? Thank you. All right. So for three of us, I'm preaching to three of us this morning. And that's fine, that's fine. Every single one of us lives into a story. We are, by nature as humans, we are narrative creatures. We can take any three events and figure out how they tie together and tell a story. When I was young, this. And then as a teenager, this. But now this. Our whole life is a narrative. And so I think it's good for us on mornings like this to actually name the story. To actually say what exactly is the story that we think we're living into. Every one of us does it. So I'm going to put up some stories on the screen that I think people live into. We live in a time where people live into consumerism. Whether you call it retail therapy or just whatever it is, that our stuff sort of defines us. And so you have to earn money so that you can buy more stuff, and it's the cycle of consuming for, most people don't even know what holiday, like they know this is a 3-day weekend, but all they really know is that there are good sales. Right? Consumerism is a story that you and I have been invited into. And for some people, that's their story. They're consumers. Here's the problem. It's a bad story. And in the end, you're consumed. Because you go from being a person, a being, to a thing. And it's called reified. You become a thing. You're a brand. You are a logo. You are an image. You are just what people see. Right? It's a bad story. For some people, achievement, that's their story. And so it starts really young. We put a lot of pressure on our kids these days, to do the right after-school programs and to excel in sports and to get the right grades so they can get into the right school and become the right kind of people and have a career that is ultimately satisfying. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a conversation happening on the interwebs about how this generation is burned out. But everybody 40 and over is like, boo-hoo, you special privileged snowflake. No. This pressure to achieve, it forms our kids. It actually creates the world that they know. I believe them when they tell me they're burned out. I feel burned out sometimes. I get it. It's a lot of pressure. I don't know if you're aware of this, but some people are really into politics these days. And here's the problem with this. It's never ending. Every 3 hours, it is a constant barrage of new data and problems. But right now, it's actually become, for some people, like a major part of their day. They wake up, it's like one of the first things they do is check in and then follow the cycle. And what did that guy do while I was asleep, right? It's like an obsession. Politics has become all-consuming for some people. Like there are people who actually have pretty good lives and are in pretty bad moods because of what's happening on the TV or in Washington. For some people, sports. Maybe they used to play sports, maybe they watch a lot of sports, but that's sort of their story. If you look at where their time and their energy and even their money goes to, right? That's a story. I think these are all little stories. So I want to put up some bigger stories. There's some ones I came up with. John Wesley had this saying, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, to all the people you can, wherever you can, for as long as you can. That's a bigger story. That's where Methodism comes from, right? That's a good story. That's a much bigger story than sports or even politics, right? Do all the good you can, that's a big story. I like that story. Some people have bought into a brand of Christianity that is all about going to heaven after you die. And basically, all you want to do in this life is not screw yourself for the next life. You just don't want to make God mad. You want to make sure you're on team heaven so that after you die, you get to go and be in the good place and you don't disqualify yourself and go to the bad place. So not only do you have to watch out for your own behavior, but you can't hang out with people who also don't have good behavior. It's called double insulation. Right? That's a bigger story For some people, that frames their entire life, is life after death. Make America great again. That's a big story. And for some people, that story really hits home. That's an attractive story. And then there's the gospel. That's what I want to talk to you about this morning. Here's the story I think you and I have been invited up into. I believe Jesus changed the very nature of religion and transformed the way we relate to God and to each other. That's a big story. It baffles me why people who call themselves Christians try to keep going back to the way religion used to be, BC. I don't get it. I don't understand the rules and regulations, the external behaviors, the personal morality as a fixation, right, and a fetish. This is such a big story. It seems tragic at some level to make it just about you and Jesus and going to heaven after you die. It just seems too small. Jesus changed the very nature of religion and transformed the way that you and I connect to God and to each other. That's, I believe, the biggest story. It's cosmic in scope and eternal in nature. And we have been invited up into the story. It's a pretty powerful invitation, because what it allows us to do is to take the seed of the New Testament that we have and to look at it and say, there's a trajectory here of ever-increasing rings of grace and inclusion. Because we as Gentiles, right, we got invited into that first ring, right? And then in the empowerment of women, and then the greater church, people of different races and nationalities, and on it goes. That story is a story of ever-increasing rings of grace and inclusion. What a great story. It's like the best story I've ever heard. In fact, the rings have reached so far that you have never, ever met somebody who God doesn't love. You have never, ever been in a conversation with somebody who is not a part of God's plan. You've never seen anybody who God doesn't have huge dreams about how their life could be. That's pretty inclusive. And grace is a wonderful thing. So that's going to be our theme today. I just wanted to introduce it. I had bought into a bad story. It was a spiritual story, but my problem is it wasn't named as spiritual. It was assumed, and so thoroughly assumed that I spliced it in where it didn't belong. Jesus said the Spirit of the Lord was upon him to preach good news to actual prisoners, to bring sight to actually blind people, to feed people who were literally hungry. And that's the work that we have been invited to do. That gets to be our story. We just have to accept the invitation. Will you pray with me? Spirit of the living God, we open ourselves to your invitation this morning. We recognize that we have been invited up into a cosmic and eternal story. We feel so small sometimes, so limited, so frustrated, so bound, too aware of ourselves, too limited in our abilities. So I pray that you will connect us as your church in a way where we bring out the best in each other, where we can accept the strength of one where we are weak, and then we can provide a strength where it's needed. We open ourselves to your story of grace and ever-increasing rings of inclusion. In Christ's name.